explain the book and not us.
Oh, okay, great. All right, good.
All right, so let's see. We are live. And let's see if we wait a few seconds to see if we have any. We usually give it a few seconds. Oh, hello. People are, there we go. Okay. Hi, how are you? Oh, wow. People are coming in. You're all in for a treat. This is such a good book, and Marisa is such a good speaker. I think everyone's going to really enjoy this event. We will, okay, open. All right. We'll start in a second.
Oops.
There we go. All right. Welcome. Let's see. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending your lunch with us here at Syosset Public Library. My name is Jessica. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist at Syosset Public Library. My librarian co-host today is
Evelyn, Reader Services Librarian.
And we're very excited to have our guest today, who is the author of this wonderful book called The Mysteries. It is absolutely captivating. I know we recently did a podcast interview for Turn the Page with Marisa. And I remember I spoke about it. I said it was it was like a coming of age and a coming of parenting story. It's just such a beautifully written story. So you're not here to listen to Evelyn and myself talk about it. So I'm going to turn it over to Marisa, and just a few housekeeping rules before we get going. This is a fun, friendly event. Any semblance of hate speech, racism, abusive language will have you removed from the meeting, which is definitely not why we're here. We're here to talk about this wonderful book. This event is in webinar mode. If you have any questions or comments, the chat is open and the Q&A is open, and Evelyn and myself will address them to Marisa. So I'm going to turn the spotlight over to you, Marisa, and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. I like to think of myself in the place that I'm speaking in. So now I'm in Syosset, which is, you know, a happy thing. The Mysteries takes place in 1973 in St. Louis, Missouri. And it is the story of a young girl named Miggy Brenneman, who is 7 years old. She's sort of a feisty, irascible, difficult, vexing, but also kind of marvelously alive little 7-year-old who is kind of pushing the limits of everything she can find to push. And she lives with her parents, Julian and Jean, and her best friend is a little girl named Ellen, who's quite different from her. Ellen is a more retiring, more quiet girl who's quite attracted to Miggy's bright and somewhat dangerous flame. And Ellen lives with her parents, Celeste and William. And the story revolves primarily around these young girls, but also about their parents. And it centers on a central tragedy that occurs about midway through the story that really changes the nature of all of their lives and changes none more so than Miggy, who at 7 has to begin to grapple with some of the real questions of life that you don't have to grapple with when you're much younger, but you begin to get a sense of as you move into your later, I think, early, the first decade of your life. So it's really about a coming of age for her, a way in which she has to confront a lot of really difficult and dark realities of life, and how she is able to do that. At the same time, it's about her parents and the other set of parents and Ellen, who are also, their lives are unalterably changed by this event. And so for everyone, it's a way of redefining the terms of their life in the face of something really tragic and that opens up a sense of the fragility of life. So that is what the book is about. It's really a book about realizations and kind of an opening awareness of the complications and the unanswerable questions of life.
Okay, so this is your 7th novel?
This is my 7th book. I've written 2
Book.
collections of short stories.
Okay,
So
okay,
I guess it's the 5th novel. But yeah.
very good. And the Mary Coyne, your last one, was a New York Times bestseller.
Mary Coyne it wasn't my last one. The last one was a book called Little Nothing, which
Oh,
was
I'm sorry.
a different kind of book, much more of a fable-like kind of parable. But Mary Coyne was a bestseller, and it was a book that was based on that famous Dorothea Lange photograph, Migrant Mother. So I sort of depicted the story of those 2 women, the photographer and the woman whose photograph was taken. And all my books are, I would say, pretty different, because I think that each story that you write sort of suggests its own way of being told. And so, each story has its own style and way of unfolding. The Mysteries, the book that we're talking about today, is a fairly realistic family drama, I would call it. And, it seeks to sort of depict primarily the kind of deep interiorities of the characters. It's really about people.
Nice.
We have a question in the chat and also a question in the Q&A. I'll take the Q&A if you would like to take the chat, Evelyn.
I think the chat question disappeared. I don't know where it went.
Oh,
Oh, there it is. I got it. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go.
Okay. Somebody, why did you decide to write this during the Nixon era?
That's a great question. The things that happen for these families are extremely tense, and I think they find their lives to be at this moment fragile. And the decisions that they made up until the moment that this tragedy occurs are kind of thrown into a great sense of turmoil. And it felt to me like the background of that era was sort of a wonderful parallel to that emotional undercurrent that's going on for the characters. The 1973 was kind of a strange, so much was going on. The Vietnam War was finally winding down. And I think there was a sense of malaise in the country after that. I think, after all the powerful protests and the things that energized people as much as they were angry, there was anger, and anger is its own kind of energy. And then when it was over, I think there was this incredible sense of malaise. There was an accounting for all the loss and the kind of the fact that it was, no one won the war. And so it felt senseless to a lot of people, even people who had supported it initially. So I think that created almost like a pall in the country. At the same time, there was an economic recession. I remember I grew up in that era, and, I remember the gas lines, and I remember, my parents deciding that we were only going to have meat once a week. And, there were lots there was a lot of a sense of precarity and insecurity because of that. And then, the Watergate hearings were happening. So the government, our sense of, faith in our leaders was certainly rocked. So I think that period created a kind of uncertainty that felt like a really great backdrop. The other reason is because it's the era when I was a child. And I think that I sourced back to a lot of sense memories. It's certainly not a book about me, but it was easy for me to reach back into the feelings of childhood in that era. Miggy is a child who is very aware of what is around her because her parents are a little more permissive and they allow her to hear the news, and the newspapers are about, and the parents are talking there. And yet she doesn't, of course, at 7 understand. So she's trying to make sense of what she senses around her, which is this kind of very precarious time in life. So I felt that a lot of it sort of serviced the emotion that was going on for the characters.
And how did you come up with this idea? Is it based on anyone you know, or?
Well, it's a tiny bit based on something that had happened to my father when he was a child. And the central event, which we're kind of, not talking about because we don't want to do spoilers, was something that occurred in his life. And he had mentioned it to me at one point, sort of a shocking thing, although at the time I don't know that I was old enough to understand the ramifications of it. And then we never talked about it again, and I never asked him about it, and I never went back as an adult and sort of said, hey, let's unpack this, and can you tell me more, and how did it affect you in your life? And so in a way, I think maybe I wrote the story to answer some of those questions for myself, or to at least invent a story that would explore what I thought was an incredibly charged situation that had happened to him, but that a situation that I didn't really know much about in terms of his history. But then I reinvented the whole thing. I mean, you know, it's about girls. It's about St. Louis. He was in Ohio. You know, it's a very different story. But that was, I think, the questions that always existed for me because of that detail that he told me in his life. Finally, I explored in fiction.
Okay, great. We have a question from Elodie. She would like to know, how is writing this book different than Mary Coyne?
Oh, well, Mary Coyne had the advantage and the challenge of being based on real history. So with Mary Coyne, I had to both understand the reality of what happened, both for in the times, which was the Depression, and for the photographer character, who was based on Dorothea Lange, and the lead character, Mary Coyne, who was based on a woman named Florence Owens Thompson, who was the famous figure in that photograph. So the advantage of that is that I had actual events that occurred to use as in my plot. And for a writer, you know, that's great. You know, if she went to this town and did that, you can have your characters go to that town and do that. And so now you know where the plot goes. The disadvantage is that there's always the question of how closely or not closely you hew to the reality. And what I chose to do was to, I felt like I understood the lives of those two women as I can know them through literature that's written about them, you know, but I can't know them, and I can't know what their emotional lives were like, and I can't know how they reacted to any given situation. So for my comfort level, and to give my imagination a chance to sort of fly, I then sort of moved away from those two characters and invented my own, using a lot of the source material, but then allowing myself to invent on top of it. With the mysteries, the characters are entirely invented. And so there's not a story to, you know, go back to and plumb for. It's what really happened, what were the plot points. So in some ways it's a little bit harder for me to write a story like the mysteries, because it really is kind of wholesale invention. But they each, you know, they each have their challenges, and they each have their deep pleasures. So, you know, that's how they were different.
Okay, now Elodie also said, I like that the girls were 7, such an interesting time of childhood.
Yeah, I think I said that too.
You know, some people have asked me, why are they 7? You know, why are they not 8 or 9? And I don't really have an answer to that, except for I felt really in my gut they're 7. And then as I began to think about it, you know, when people are asking me, I think 7 feels to me like a time in life where you can hold two things at once. You can hold a kind of magical thinking, you know, Miggy thinks there's a monster in the woods outside her home, and she truly believes that, and she believes that the monster might come and eat her. At the same time that she begins to understand the, you know, truisms in the world. And so I kind of felt like it was this perfect age where you can hold both those things at the same time. And that feels like something that certainly doesn't happen when we grow up. So it was a wonderful thing to be able to write about a little girl who believes in a monster in the woods, but who also begins to understand the nature of life and death.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it felt very real. I have 6-year-olds, and they're very into imaginative play right now, and it's almost like they have this they have this whole world. I mean, granted, they're twins, and they've been in the house, really only the 2 of them, since last March. But it's really interesting to kind of see the development, because there is a lot of magical thinking at that age. And I have one son who's definitely more of the irrepressible, probably, you know, bright, flame who's crazy and has actually just started saying I am and his name. So I'm like, oh my God, there it is, just like Miggy. And the other one's just a little bit more quiet and introspective, but it's amazing the things that he comes out with. And there's like an insight in it as well, even though, you know, some of it is like, it's definitely magical thinking. And my mother is always trying to be like, okay, but you know, that isn't real. And I'm like, he's developing this. Don't like.
Also, I think that
Yeah.
question of what is real is really important. I mean, what is real? I think your magical thinking is as real as reality. It's real to you, right? Miggy
Right.
does believe there's a monster in the woods. She hears it. So yeah, I think that question of what is real and what is not real, I think, you know, sometimes adults sort of kill the other side of it for children. The question you also brought up that your son says I am in his name, and she's referring to something in the book, which is Miggy declares herself a lot. She says, I am Miggy, I am Miggy. And her parents, when they're vexed with her, when they don't know why she did what she did, through a rock through a window or whatever, they'll go, who are you? And I think it's sort of a central question in the book, who am I? And for all the characters, Miggy is figuring out who she is, certainly relative to these events, but all the characters are sort of figuring out who they are relative to something quite crucial and disruptive that happens in their lives. Yeah.
It was so crazy that he started, like, he just recently started doing it.
Maybe he read the mysteries.
It's possible, but like, that's not even a spoil. Like, that's like one of the first things Miggy does when you meet her. Somebody, just to kind of like read there's a comment from Amber that says the photograph that probably when we were talking about Mary Queen, that photograph migrant mother has so much subtext.
It does have so much subtext. I mean, it's a photograph that it certainly has enough subtext that it made me want to write a novel about it. You know, I mean, the photograph is so odd. It's this woman. I don't know whether many of you have the visual in your mind, but you know, the woman who's looking out, and she's obviously looking, she seems withered and somewhat, you know, ravaged by the experience she's going through in the depression, but also strong and incredibly and beautiful in a lot of ways to me. And then her children are on either side of her, and they're sort of facing backwards, which is something that the photographer made happen. And it really evokes images of, you know, Mary, with angels on her side. There's so much that it evokes, but it certainly was evocative enough to me to spend 3 years writing a novel about it.
And how long did it
One
take?
thing about when you launch into a novel, you have to make sure that whatever it is has enough resonance for you philosophically, emotionally, that you can spend the next 3 years of your life writing it, because it's a long, long process and you have to continually keep your interest in it. So I think with the mysteries, you know, the question of how these characters confront life and death and what it does to relationships and what it does to your sense of identity certainly kept me in its grips for those. And the other thing about the mysteries, and the reasons it's called the mysteries, is it doesn't really seek to answer. You know, I think for me, what's interesting about life is the things that are mysterious and the things that are not answerable, but the questions that you continue to ask and that you continue to have different insights into as you develop. So, you know, part of what these people grapple with is not answers, but just the fact that there are these sort of mysteries in life that are not solvable.
It's so interesting, and I think we have some more stuff going in the chat, and I see we have new people here, and I'd like to welcome you virtually to Syosset Public Library. I want to let you know that this is in webinar mode, so if you have questions and comments for Marisa about the mysteries or her writing process or her books, please drop them in the chat and the Q&A, and Evelyn and myself will address them to Marisa. But what I wanted to say really quickly is, you know, my parents are now in their 70s, and we kind of have this talk when we talk about, you know, like just the mysteries and how things are different as you're growing up. You know, my father, who went through something recently for health, had made a comment that like he still feels like that 20-year-old screw up sometimes. And I think about this sometimes too. And I know when we talked about this for the podcast, we talk about how adulthood looks differently now than it did in my parents' age and subsequently. I was like sitting on the couch with my kids, showing them how to play Super Mario Brothers and Tetris. And, like I'm back to being Miggy and Ellen's age.
I think that's something wonderful about life is that we exist. Every phase of us exists, right? Every part of our life. We don't jettison childhood. It just becomes, it folds in and then it perks up at the oddest times, as you're saying.
Yeah.
When you were talking about that, it made me think about something else that I was thinking about when I wrote the book, which was that, there was a very different attitude towards parenting in 1973 than there is right now. And I was really, Miggy has a lot of freedom. She can run up and down her block. She can't cross the street by herself yet until she learns. But there's a sense of, and this was certainly true in my childhood, there wasn't so much fear. There wasn't a sense of kind of this pervasive fear of the world for children. There was a lot more freedom. And at the same time, children were not kind of medicalized in the same way. I mean, I think that a Miggy today someone would be worried, does she have some kind of something, is she ADHD? Is she, and it was really important to me to write from the perspective of 1973, where Miggy is just Miggy. She's not a medical problem. She's just a kind of alive, somewhat unmanageable child who has a personality, right? And to also allow for the kind of sense of freedom that a child would have in that era without judgment. I think we're quick to judge, right? We're quick to be very much judgy these days about how parents are. Are they good mothers or bad mothers and all that? And although I think some of that probably existed in 1973, I think that there wasn't the same level of sort of fixation on this idea of parenting. I think you were parents, but I don't think the verb parenting was much in use. The idea of that was like a job or a way of being, or that would be the central focus of your life. Very different times. And so I think the book reflects a little bit of that in terms of how the children in it are raised.
There's I know we also talked briefly just about how in these days, because Ellen's and I want to talk actually because there is a question from the audience. Let's just get to that because I want the audience to have the say in this. We already spoke. Okay, so Ella D would like to know, how did you build the mood in the mysteries? The pacing was so well done.
Oh, thank you so much, Elodie. I appreciate that. I don't know how to answer that because there's a kind of intuitive quality to writing. What I'm always thinking about is, how are the characters developing over the course of a book? How are each separate character developing? I'm thinking about how are the particular storylines developing? And I'm making sure that that word developing happens, that there's a kind of ratcheting up of not only tension in the book, but character change and character and how we know characters. And this is kind of abstract. I'm not sure that this is going to be very helpful, but I think that what I realized about this book was that it really isn't a book about plot, or that maybe another way to put it is that the characters are the plot, and the way in which they are revealed to us slowly through what their response to what happens is ultimately the kind of mystery or drama of this book. And so in as much as there's sort of an intuitive sense of how a story should take shape, I also, thought about, well, when do we know certain things about certain characters, and how does not knowing something at a certain point in time make you want to turn the page so that you can find out? So a lot of it is thinking about how withholding certain information allows a reader to get more deeply involved. But I do think that what I'm hearing back from readers about this book is that it's the level of engagement with character that is what's moving them through the novel. It's not really a what happened. I mean, you don't really know what's going to happen until it happens. And then really nothing, there's not many more big plot points. So it's really about kind of the slow unraveling of character. And I think for most of us, that's pretty interesting. I mean, that's, we think about our friends, and it's getting to know people is this constant, it never ends, right? You never really feel like you've grasped somebody. Just when you think you have, they do something completely opposite to what you imagine they would, and suddenly you have to reimagine them all over again, or you have to widen out your idea of what the potential of their personality is. And that's what really the kind of the crux of this book is.
So just to kind of, and then I'll get to Amber's question. Elodie says, yes, quiet tension, atmosphere is everything.
Thank you.
Let's see. Amber says, what was your process in constructing the parents? Smiley face.
That's a great question. It's fun, and you've hit on the hardest thing in the book that Miggy sort of popped into my mind, and she was almost fully fledged. I mean, I just sort of saw her, I heard her, I knew what her body was like, I knew how she moved, I knew what her, how she would respond to most given situations. The parents were harder, and I think part of what was hard about writing the parents was that they are, all of them in different ways, ambivalent about the choices that they've made in their lives. And ambivalence turns out to be a really hard thing to write. It's easy to write characters who sort of know what they want and they go after it and they're single-minded. I mean, those characters tend to be fairly flat and not that interesting, but they're certainly easier to write. But when you have a character that takes an action and then second guesses the action almost immediately, or has an impulse and then doesn't follow through because they're not sure about what, then it's very hard to establish for a reader who that person is. And yet it's exactly what I wanted to sort of talk about. I mean, I feel generally pretty ambivalent about most things. Not that I don't know my own mind, but I can see many sides of something. Just when you think you love something, you also are hurt by it. That's what I wanted to convey. So it really was the answer to how I did it was spending 3.5 years trying to get closer and closer and closer to these people until the kind of variety of responses that they had to any given situation not only demonstrated their ambivalence about their lives, but also that is the kind of sum total of a person is, drives and ambivalences and questions.
Amber says she was such a believable character. Everyone knows that kid.
Everyone knows that kid. I had that kid. I remember, I just remembered this. It's funny that I didn't remember it before, but this was in preschool. There was this girl in my preschool, and she was, that kid. She had this kind of unbelievable charisma. And part of it was because there was a sense of danger about her. You always were sure she was going to do something just a little bit too far. And for a more quiet or dutiful child like I was, that's really appealing because they're sort of expressing a lot of the things that you don't express, but you might have inside of you, but you sort of you put the brakes on. And so this girl took me over to her house one day, and somehow she convinced me that she wanted to cut all my hair off, and I let her. And I really do feel like I remember my mother's reaction when I walked in with, chopped, horrible hair. But I think, there are those kids who are both, they're magic and they're so compelling. And they're mercurial in a way that, and I think as adults, we are sometimes attracted to those kinds of people as well. There's something alive and energetic about them, but as much as they make us feel great, they make us feel bad.
Portia says your hair looks good considering.
I've had a few decades to grow it out.
That happened to me too when I was a kid. I mean, I'm not going to say, I think I had my Miggy moments. I was certainly, I was definitely a magical thinker, which is why, like, when my son comes up with these things, I'm like, tell me more about it,
Well, I think that a lot of, I remember these kids, and my children are adults now, but I certainly remember the kids who I was a little bit nervous about, They're
Right.
friends who made me nervous.
Yeah.
And would I have liked them not to be friends with that kid? Maybe, but I I didn't stop them. But that child, I could see the attraction. I could see what they represented, and it made me anxious.
Like we had a very small strip of trees next to my house, and I mean not deep at all. And it was the forest. Like we'd go in, like we'd go in there and we'd pick up sticks, and it was the forest, and we were knights and princesses.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is one of my friends in preschool, her mother was a hairdresser, and she had a business outside of her basement. And one day, my mother my mother left me at their house, which is something you talk about a little bit, how like parenting, like you didn't have play dates where both parents would have to hang out. Like
Right.
you'd just be like, I'm dropping you off. And she cut bangs on me, and my mother was like 100% anti-bangs. Like she hated bangs, never wanted me to have them. And it was like always brought up like, oh, you want to go over her house? Remember when she cut bangs on you?
Well, one of the interesting things about being a parent is when you begin to see what your child's predilections are, and sometimes they're wonderful and you're excited, and sometimes you're sort of nervous and maybe even a little bit worried for what they seem to yearn toward. And then the question is, what do you do with that? But again, I mean, going back to 1973, this was not an era of parenting. This was not an era of where people will, I mean, there were certainly books, but it wasn't this sense of that sort of parenting was something that you could study and then apply to your children, which I think is sort of the era that we live in, for better or for worse. No mommy blogs. Exactly, Elodie. No mommy blogs.
Yeah,
I think
mommy.
maybe that's a good thing, that there weren't mommy blogs.
There was
Yeah,
no
I think.
internet. I mean,
But
internet.
listen, on this, at the same token, obviously we know so much more. We can be helpful to children who really are struggling with stuff, and when I grew up, there was kids who were having trouble in school, were, there was no help for them. So obviously there's great advantages to the fact that we spent more time thinking about children and how to be better parents, but there's a tipping point, I think.
Evelyn, do you want to? There was a question in the chat that I didn't get to. Do you want to take it?
Oh, the one, how long I think you told us, but
Oh, did I? Oh, okay.
How long did this take to write?
Oh, it took about 3.5 years, which is a little bit longer than other books of mine. And I was surprised by that because it's not that complicated a narrative. But I think that what I talked about before, how it was, I realized that it's really about character, that I just had to keep spending more and more time getting invested in these people. And in the same way that, the longer you spend with someone, the more you know them, and the more you, a friend, it really felt like that. It felt like, yeah, I know them, but I don't know them quite well enough yet. So it was it took a long time. It was a long time with a set of people in my mind, trying to figure out. And then, and when you're writing a book, it's not only figuring out who they are, but then figuring out how you're going to express that in language, and what actions are going to help you convey that to a reader, or what interior thoughts are going to help you convey it, and how does that then function in the overall plot of your book. So it took a while.
And then the editing process, of course, you have to go
Yeah.
through that.
Yeah.
Have you always wanted to be a writer, an author? Was that your goal?
Oh, no, not at all. I began my career as a filmmaker.
Okay.
And I made films in my 20s. I made a bunch of movies. And then when I got to be about 30, I just had this kind of awareness that I was telling stories, but I wasn't telling stories in the right medium. Movies are great, but you don't have the same level of well, first of all, movies don't really access interiority. We don't hear the thoughts of a character in a film. And I really wanted to have that ability to spend time inside of people. So I made a switch, and it proved to be a very happy one.
Have any of these books been made into movies?
No, I mean, they've been, optioned occasionally, but no.
No.
It's very hard to get a movie made. That much I know from the other side.
Right. But since you have that, you would think maybe you'd be able to.
I think that Well, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that, but it hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
This set some, let's see. Oh, Elodie says, true, there was Dr. Spock, and that was it, I guess, talking about parenting as,
Exactly.
yeah.
Dr. Spock was everybody's single parenting guide. One of the characters in the book, the mother of Ellen, Miggy's little friend, is suffering from postpartum depression. And I got a book from that era to try to think, read about how people were understanding that. And it was really, it was, oh, baby blues, and, you'll get over it. And you just have to try harder. And, it was the least supportive of a mother going through that. But it really, and I think I quoted it in the book, but it was different era for sure.
Yeah, that was a really good side storyline, which was, I mean, because everything is sort of going on around Miggy and Ellen, and as a mom,
the parents in the book are all having their own. I mean, Miggy's parents are struggling in their relationship. They're struggling financially. Ellen's parents are much more well off, but the mother is suffering. She's just had a child, a little brother for Ellen, and she's struggling with postpartum depression and also a background of mental illness in her own family. And her husband, who loves her very much, doesn't quite understand what's going on. So the parents are all in a kind of, as people are, they're all dealing with their own issues. And then this event happens, which sort of spins the whole story around and changes the nature of all of these relationships.
Yeah, I liked Miggy's parents as well. They all seemed very real.
When I was kind of conceiving of Miggy's parents, I was, there are people who grew up who were in college in the 60s and very involved in, all the protest movements, and sort of saw themselves as being, these children of that era who would go off and go to the coasts and be artists. And then that's not what happens for a series of circumstances. And so part of what they're dealing with, and they're young, they're 30, but in 1973, 30 was older than it is now. They're kind of confronting the fact that their lives are a lot more conventional than they imagined that they would be.
Yeah.
And that's, something that creates tension in their family.
Amber once says the setting was the Midwest. Are you from that area?
I am. I was born in Ohio. I moved actually to New York City when I was 7, but I think that my sense memory of childhood is very much based in the Midwest. I didn't write it about my particular childhood in Ohio, primarily because St. Louis is a city that I've gotten to know over 30 years because I married someone from St. Louis. And so I've spent a lot of time there, and I find it's a fascinating city. And I feel like I know it better in some ways than I knew the place where I was, raised a child, but where I haven't spent much adult life. And I think St. Louis is a really fascinating city, both historically, visually. It's interesting. What it was going through at that time was emblematic of what a lot of the country was going through. It sort of sits right, as we know, in sort of the center of the country. And there's that arch, and there's something about being sort of poised between East and West that somehow felt emotionally or lyrically relevant to the film. But I loved writing about it. It's a great and fascinating city.
Amber says so much change between now and I guess between now and maybe between now and then, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it for some of us it's part of our lifetime, but it's actually, it's 50 years ago, and a lot. I mean, to think about what's changed in those 50 years is astonishing, including computers, the internet, and one of the reasons why the film is set in the past and not set now is that in some ways I think that what happens in it might not have happened as easily with all that kind of rapid communication, because cell phones, texting, all that stuff, I think might have made what happens in the story not happen quite so believably. And also I just kind of wanted to write about an era before that, an era where that wasn't part of the fabric of people's lives.
I've actually, and I see we just had another attendee. You still have some time left. If you have any questions for Marisa about the mysteries or her books, please drop them in the chat in the Q&A. Welcome. Yeah, you know, there's been a lot of books that I've written recently that
Have
I'm
you
sorry,
written
sorry, not written, man, read. This is
your
what
secret life. You've written 20 books.
Listen, I've only had one cup of coffee today. I need more to actually form a coherent sentence. That I've read recently. And Evelyn, I don't know if you have been noticing this as well, but there's been a lot of books that have been set, I guess, as late as the 90s or before, because technology does complicate things so much.
Right.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to figure out how to handle all that as a writer. You know, you have to, I mean, it's not hard. You just have to make a choice. And you know, if you're writing something that's very contemporary, you know, you can't avoid the fact that technology has become such a crucial part of people's lives and such a kind of regular part of people's lives. It's not even something to remark upon. In the same way that, you know, I have friends now who are writing books that are taking place at this moment, and they're struggling to how to fold in the pandemic into their narratives. You know, should they fold it in? Is it, you know, how can you conceive of writing about this time and people have to wear masks, you know? So those kinds of questions about how you conceive of the contemporary moment in fiction is really one of the great questions that a writer has to deal with.
Yeah, I think a lot of authors are going to be writing in 2019. They're going to write it.
Well, or you know, now as things hopefully are beginning to open up, maybe, you know, they don't have to wear masks all the time.
Right.
So, you know,
2019 will be the year that they pick because it's before the pandemic, but yet they have social media and all those other things. So
yeah, but I mean, a book that takes place in 2022, 2023, it's hard to imagine that those characters are not in some way, emotionally at least, going to be referencing this cataclysm that happened in our lives.
There is a question in the chat from somebody who, you got it?
Yep. C. Farrell wants to know, how do you balance your writing life and your teaching and reading life? Sorry for coming so late.
Oh, not at all. I'm glad that you came. Well, that's a great question. That's probably the question of you know, every day that I get up. What I do with my writing life is I really try to create a sort of a job for myself every day. And my job is to create a certain number of words. So I write a certain number of words every day. And once I complete those words, then my writing day is over and successful, no matter how good or bad those words are. But I feel like, you know, the more words you put on the page, you're moving your thinking, you're moving your story forward. I keep my teaching to, actually, I teach in a low residency program, which means that I'm physically with my students only 2 weeks of a year, but then I'm working with them, sending back and forth their work virtually and responding over email. And I do that work on the weekends, actually, so that it doesn't take place during my week, which is my writing time. And reading is just constant. So, you know, I mean, I consider reading to be work. So I luckily have given myself a justification to read whenever I feel like it.
That sounds great.
Yeah. You know what? It's a wonderful life, and I feel really fortunate. And you know, as hard as it is to write a book, and it's hard to make art, but it's, you know, it's hard to also complain that that's, you know, how I spend my time.
So what are you reading now? What can you recommend?
Well, actually, I've been rereading quite a bit. I just reread an incredible novel by Chang-Rae Lee called A Gesture Life. He has a new novel out now, but this is an older novel, and I just love it. I read a wonderful book by Joan Silber.
I want to read that.
Called Secrets of Happiness, which is really remarkable, and all her work is remarkable. And I really encourage your listeners to check her out. She's an extraordinary writer, one of our best. So I read really randomly. I just, you know, I don't, you know, whatever piques my fancy. And so I don't have a sort of, you know, curriculum of reading.
Portia wants to know, when you are in the editing process, are you still producing new words every day?
Not that many. So that's, yeah, once I'm in, that's a first draft kind of imperative, these number of words a day. Once I'm in the editing process, I can actually, I tend to write much longer and more during that time because the material is there for me. It's hard to generate it out of nothing, to put words on the blank page. So that's why I give myself that job each day. But the editing process is something that, I can sit down for 8 hours and play with what's there. That's the fun part for me.
Oh, wait a second. I was just about to tell Elodie we're getting to her question, but we'll get to her question now. Do you have beta readers?
What does that mean, beta readers? Oh, beta, like beta testing, like people who read before the thing is finished. Yeah, I'm different for different books. My husband is always my beta reader for, I force him through many, many drafts of each book, which he is, luckily delighted to do and be involved with. And he's quite a wonderful reader and a wonderful thinker about story. So that's lucky for me. I tend to give my agent, who is also an extraordinarily good reader and thinker, sort of chunks, like the first third, the second third. And then, but mostly when those are much further along. And then, each book, sometimes I'll seek out a friend who I feel like would have a connection to the material and be useful to get that person's read. But I don't have like a writing group, and I don't have a particular people each time who read my work. And sometimes for me, I know when it's not working, and sometimes I feel like the answers are within me. I just have to spend the time thinking further. So sometimes it's really just on me.
I forget who, just to kind of go back to something when you and Evelyn were talking about just the era of the story and, like people not writing things in 2020. I spoke to a writer recently who, we were talking about suspense and horror, and he feels that there's going to be books coming out of this time period, a lot of haunted house books, because people are haunting their own houses.
That's fascinating. That's really
I thought so too.
Well, it's also, as many people have said, we're living what we thought was a dystopian novel. Turns out to be reality. But, so which will be an interesting thing too. It's like, what will the dystopian novel look like now that we've lived through what a lot of people imagined was a dystopian novel? I'll be very fascinated to see what comes next.
Yeah, me too. I think like last year there was a big, a lot of people were saying like nobody's going to want to read a COVID novel, but I think that it's not necessarily going to be a COVID novel. So, I think there's going to be a lot of novels with COVID as the backdrop that like almost deal with the human condition, the human spirit, the family unit.
I think you're right, because I think people look to fiction often to explore the questions that are swirling around in their minds. And that when we have that wonderful sense of, when we read a book where we feel like, God, it really dug deep inside of us, it's because we associated a lot of emotion that we have to whatever this book was about. And it created a sense of wonder and a way of opening up questions that we've been struggling with. So, and listen, no one can predict what people want to read. If people could do that, the publishing business would be very different. Who knows what people want to read, and I think, it'll be surprising. And I bet there will be novels about COVID, and as you say, that have a kind of psychological component and an emotional component that will be really appealing, because it'll help us understand and frame what it is we've been through.
So what are you writing now?
I'm not writing a book about that. And I tend not to talk about what I'm writing just because it's kind of fragile in the beginning state, but it's another novel set entirely in a different time and place about a different topic.
Okay, terrific.
Just again, the audience, we have about 10 more minutes, so please drop questions and comments in if you have them. I guess I have a question. As a former filmmaker, do you watch a lot of movies and TV now? What are you usually drawn to?
I don't really, lately, in the last few years, I haven't been watching a lot of films. I don't know why. I don't have an answer to that. So, like everybody, I sometimes binge watch things for, to let my mind rest for a while and just enjoy something. Some of them are better than worse or than others. I think that primarily what I do in terms of absorbing art is I read and I, you know, and one of the difficulties this year was not being able to go to museums and see art, but I think looking at art is a really something that I love and something that is very inspiring to me. But no, not so much lately, not so much film.
Yeah, I think there's been what was it? Elodie says film has changed so much because of the pandemic. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my desire at the moment to go sit in a movie theater is pretty low, but yeah, I'm not sure where I'm at with that right now.
Yeah, I know.
So many streaming services now.
It's so, yeah, and sometimes it's almost like there's too much. I just
That's
feel
how I feel.
overwhelmed by how much there is, and it sort of makes everything feel less,
Right.
you know, kind of urgent or special. And the fact that it's always there for you, you know, there's great things about that. And then there's stuff that it sort of makes it, you say, oh, I'll watch it another time, and then you never watch it.
That's how I am. I'm so overwhelmed by it that I can't even make a choice. Like I can't even pick what to watch because there's so much out there.
Yeah.
I don't feel that way with books, luckily.
Well, that's
Yeah,
good.
Evelyn is a voracious
I
reader.
love the fact that there's so much out there and so much to read. And
Yeah.
I'm a big audiobook fan. Was this book out on audio?
The book is out on audio. I haven't listened to it, but it is out on
okay.
audio. And I am a fan of audiobooks too. But you know, sometimes they can be made or broken by the reader. So, you know, it's a funny thing to have someone read a book to you. It can, I mean, I've heard books that I feel like, yeah, I might like this book if it weren't read by this actor or this person.
Right. Did you get to choose the narrator for your book?
Yeah. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is lovely.
Oh, Amber just asked the same question, Evelyn.
I didn't even see that.
No, I mean, literally as you finished answering it. Oh, there we go. There's another question from Portia. Do you want to grab that one, Evelyn?
Sure. Do you feel protective about what you allow yourself to watch or read, be influenced by during the period when you are writing the first draft of your novel?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a smart observation. Yeah, I'm really careful about what I put into my brain and what voice is in there. And you know, when I read, I tend to read more, when I'm writing, at least, I tend to read more in terms of craft. Like I'm trying to see, okay, I'm struggling with the time structure. Let me read this book because I know it has an interesting structure and the way it moves through time is interesting. I don't read books about my subject. You know, I'm not looking to see how another person did a 7-year-old girl, except for occasionally. I mean, I did read the wonderful What Maisie Knew by Henry James a few times. Yeah, I'm reading. And then if I start a book and the sound of it is not what I want in my mind, even if I think it might be a good book, I'll put it down. But yeah, I'm pretty careful about that. I mean, it's hard to hear your own voice, you know, and it's hard to have integrity with that and to not sort of stray all over the place. And so I am very curatorial about what voices I let in so that I don't inadvertently move away from the intention of my voice.
I wanted to know, is there another time period you're itching to write about?
Yeah, I mean, there's no time period that I'm like itching to write about. It's really about, you know, what the story is.
Right.
But, you know, I have not written, I'm kind of maybe wanting to write something super now, you know, just because, I don't know, it's just a challenge that I don't always take up. It's maybe for those reasons, well, because you have to contend with the moment and you have to sort of, it's sometimes for me, it's harder to understand the moment that we're living through without a lot of perspective. But I think that's a good challenge in its own. So, but yeah, I mean, it's not like I want to write about 1600 or 17, you know, it's really about story. And if I land on a story and it takes place in 1750, I'll go there, you know?
Very nice.
Yeah.
All right. Evelyn, any more questions before we wrap up? And audience, any more questions or comments before we wrap up?
No, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thanks everyone for spending lunch with me and at the Syosset Library. And I really appreciate your interest in the book. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And The Mysteries is out in libraries and bookstores and bookshop.org, and check it out. I think, I mean, it sounds like a lot of people read the book who are here, but if you have not, please do. It's wonderful. I think it's going to be well received by a lot of audiences. And well, I think it's a good book club book, actually.
Yeah, definitely a good
From
book.
your lips to God's ear, as they say.
Great book club book. Book clubs are going to want to discuss
I
this.
love, you know, when book clubs are wonderful, and you know, the seriousness that they give to books that we write is really powerful. So that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, you know what? I think that the first time I've ever been in an actual formal book club was during the pandemic, because I was reading a lot, and Zoom made it easy for me to speak to friends no matter what their time zone was.
It's
So-
also, yeah, it's wonderful. But I love book clubs. I think it's a wonderful, and it's been going on for centuries, which
seriously.
is yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
everybody,
much,
for coming. I
Marisa Silver.
appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Care.
And everybody have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.